Happy Thursday. It is my second video on speech, the series I'm doing on free speech and other kinds of speech. Ironically, my own freedom of speech has hit me in the pocketbook. More on this later. So if you like these videos, if you want to see more stuff like this, help support this channel, become a monthly patron, patreon.com/JulianaK. Thursday is the day that patrons normally get their slice of life video. Usually something adorable involving cats, though I am going to be doing some unboxing videos related to my move pretty soon. I've got boxes that came out of my crawl space. I have no idea what they are, so I'm just going to open them up and see what's inside for the amusement of the patrons. But what Patreon actually does is sort of offset the ding to my pocketbook that speaking truth to power, especially when it comes to women in games, has resulted in. And that's why these two particular concepts of free speech from the ancient Greek world are of particular interest to me. Now, the words are kind of tongue twisters, so I tried to do them on like graphics and stuff like that, but OBS Studio creates graphics that kind of look like butt to me. Like, they look really bad, all jagged and everything like that, and I was kind of pressed for time, so I just wrote them on a card. So the two main concepts we're going to be looking at today are Isegoria, roughly translated as equality of public speech, and parrhesia, or candid or bold speech. Those are the two concepts we're looking at today, but there's going to be a lot of other stuff around the edges because the ancient Greek city-state of Athens laid the groundwork for multiple concepts surrounding speech that its period counterparts didn't share. Macedonia and Sparta thought these Athenian concepts were kind of cuckoo. While the area of Athens has been inhabited by humans in some way since before 3000 BCE, Athens reached its cultural height under Pericles, and his rule lasted approximately between 461 and 429 BCE-ish. No one's entirely sure. The thing that made Pericles different from his counterparts and his forebears is that he used money collected through an alliance of city-states called the Delian League to invest in Athens' arts and culture. He rebuilt the Acropolis, he built the Parthenon, and numerous arches, temples, statues, and theaters, most notably dedicated to the city's namesake, the goddess Athena, though Hephaestus and Apollo and gods like that got their due too. If it was pretty, Pericles commissioned it. Part of this was because they were make-work projects for citizens of Athens, and Pericles was a political populist. He didn't invent democracy. That happened about a whopping 50 years prior to his rule, but he greatly expanded democracy, making it more direct and participatory. Granted, democratic participation was limited to full citizens of Athens, and this meant no women, foreigners, or slaves could participate. So true democratic participation was still only available to a relative few in the golden age of Athenian democracy. So when we talk about free speech in Athens, keep in mind that speech was only free to a relative minority of the population. For that minority of the population that was native-born, male, and not a slave, democratic participation in Athens was shaped by three primary concepts: isonomia, or equality under the law; isokratia, or equality of power; and isegoria, on the card, equal right to address political assemblies. That last term, isegoria, which I told you is equality in public speech, is also often translated to freedom of speech, even though that really wasn't what it meant. The Athenians and the ancient Hebrews had that second free speech concept, parrhesia, or candid and bold speech, which is more the backbone of Western society's satire and parody protections, as well as protections regarding the right to offend. Isegoria and parrhesia are two extremely different concepts that clash in some important ways. They were subject to profoundly different applications in ancient Athens, and the fact that both concepts have been mistranslated as free speech has led to some profound disconnects in modern day understandings and applications of freedom of expression. The only thing they really have in common is that they both were involved in political discussions, in government assembly discussions, but that's where the similarities end. Isegoria, on the card, is about equal access to public speech platforms, specifically the right to address political assemblies. Isegoria guaranteed male citizens of Athens the right to speak, because women weren't considered full citizens, but it didn't protect those men from being dragged off by an angry mob if they didn't like what the guy had to say. The big leap forward, courtesy of Pericles, was that the wealthy didn't have enhanced status under Isegoria. Pericles let even the poorest citizens of Athens have a voice in theory, though apparently many didn't use it for fear of repercussions. The equal platform concept of Isegoria has trickled down to the modern day in some interesting ways. The college campus no platforming movement uses the concept of equality of speech to justify denying a platform to those with views they perceive to be bigoted. The thinking is that things like sexism, racism, homophobia, and transphobia silence people who identify with these groups. So silencing the silencing behavior is done in service to preserving an equal platform, based on the assumption that privileged groups already have a massive platform. This theory, which draws from Isegoria, believes that equality of speech is more important than liberty of expression. Another descendant of Isegoria that might be more recognizable to ancient Athens, because admittedly that application is a bit of a brain twister, is social media. Anybody can take out a free Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or Tumblr, God help you, account and send their thoughts out into the internetverse. This doesn't mean that saying certain things won't get someone internet mobbed. A huge problem with all populist ideas is that the likelihood of descent into mob rule is high. The increasingly restrictive terms of service on these social media platforms are a result of trying to stave off mob rule on social media, and that was kind of what happened back in ancient Athens as well. And that's where parrhesia comes in, the other version of Athenian free speech, which is much more recognizable to First Amendment activists because it involves the right to offend. Hard truths were seen as essential to the common good by Athenian philosophers, and parrhesia was a concept that involved speaking candidly and boldly, notably in political debates and in literature and theater. The Golden Age of Athens was an era of scathing theatrical social commentary, sometimes vicious enough to make Tucker Carlson blush. Oh, Tucker Carlson doesn't blush. He's far too manly. I'm satirizing now. Playwrights sometimes even savaged their own friends and associates back then. So political opponents were definitely not spared. However, an important component to parrhesia was that the speaker had to believe the opinions to be true, even if they were harsh. The intent was not to manipulate an audience, which connects the idea of parrhesia more closely to dialectic, as opposed to sophistry, rhetoric, or outright manipulation. And I know this is really heady. The point is, times have really changed in that regard. Even in Athens, though, parrhesia was practiced at one's own peril because it was grounded in a very fluid form of social contract with individual audiences. The idea of risk is hardwired into the purest form of parrhesia. Parrhesia carried a responsibility to speak truth for the common good, as I said, especially when speaking that truth carried personal risk. This idea that parrhesia was inherently virtuous became extremely important during the Enlightenment, and I'll get into that more in future videos. But back in ancient Greece, one of the most hardcore practitioners of parrhesia was Diogenes the Cynic, who made challenging local custom into a complete lifestyle, defying cultural norms by doing things like eating in the marketplace, shocking, carrying a lamp in daylight, weird, and living in a large clay wine jar. That's pretty hardcore. If there was a social norm, Diogenes would violate it just because he could, because he thought social norms were often inherently ridiculous. He also apparently told Alexander the Great to get out of his light. Dude was snarky. But the most hardcore parrhesia award might go to Socrates, or Socrates in Bill and Ted, who continued to speak what he believed to be truths in the waning years of Athens' golden age when terms of service regarding public speech were waning. He criticized Athenian democracy while they were losing the war to Sparta and dared to question the oracle at Delphi, or Delphi in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. That's probably the right pronunciation. However, it was his process for determining that the oracle was right after all that offended the wrong people, leading to Socrates' trial and execution. A friend of Socrates asked the oracle if anyone were wiser than Socrates. The oracle responded that no one was wiser. Socrates believed this wrong because he believed that, in fact, he possessed no wisdom at all. So Socrates proceeded to test this theory by approaching men considered wise by the community to test the theory. Socrates determined that while these men were believed to be wise and believed themselves wise, these men, in fact, believed they knew much more than they actually did and therefore lacked wisdom, negative wisdom, decrease in score. So, based on this, Socrates determined that the oracle had in fact been correct. Socrates was wiser than these wise men by virtue of not overrating his own wisdom. A big 0 is greater than -2. By humiliating a collection of high-status Athenians, though, Socrates got himself into trouble and showed the limits of free speech in Athens. Socrates was charged with things that seem familiar even in today's free speech challenges: corrupting the youth of Athens and impiety, which is basically blasphemy. Upon his conviction, he willingly drank poisoned hemlock for reasons including his belief that no true philosopher feared death, and that if he attempted to escape punishment, he'd be breaking his social contract with the state that had allowed him to speak candidly and boldly all this time, which was something he believed to be an inherently unvirtuous act. Socrates' story shows the limits of the social contract inherent in parrhesia. Parrhesia is essentially a contract with a given audience to offend them, and that contract can be ended by the audience at any time if the audience grows too offended. Many modern entertainers have felt the sting of those limits to parrhesia, including Louis C.K., Kevin Hart, and Gilbert Gottfried. There is sometimes little sense regarding what offense an audience sees as acceptable as opposed to what it believes crosses a line. And the parrhesiac tradition requires an acceptance of this fact. Neither Greek concept, Isegoria or parrhesia, protects a speaker from the consequences of their speech. In fact, parrhesia implies that you're not doing it right until you suffer some negative consequences, since people tend to not like hard truths. The virtue in parrhesia lies in accepting those sometimes harsh consequences as the burden of speaking truth to power. This is very true. Learn from, I would say, my mistakes, but under this model, it's a virtue. And this is something that gets lost in a lot of modern free speech debates. The right to speak does not offer any protection from social consequences of that speech. A government can't execute you or throw you in jail for what you say as long as you're living in a free speech society, but companies can choose to not associate with you. You can become a social pariah and your livelihood can be affected. You can even be sued for defamation and stuff like that. No free speech protection has ever protected a speaker against these social and professional consequences. So beware public figures who cry that they're being persecuted because people take issue with what they have to say. Like it or not, private institutions such as colleges, corporations, and social media services, which are corporations, are not the government. And so they have no restrictions against deplatforming offensive or unpopular speech. And those of us who engage in unpopular speech, especially when speaking truth to power, must be prepared to accept the consequences, even if we don't feel they're fair. What we should not accept collectively is an environment for expression that is increasingly controlled by institutions and corporations, precisely because it will get to the point where government protections regarding expression are meaningless, since everything is corporatized. We may already be at the point where speech isn't free. It's monetized. And that means that corporations can silence you through your pocketbook unless you're prepared to live in the equivalent of a wine jar like Diogenes. And that's sort of the lesson we can take from the Greeks, and some things we should be on the lookout, we should be vigilant against now. It is a real concern that we continue to have conversations and advocate for free speech on corporate, private platforms that actually offer none of those protections, because it ends up being like ancient Athens. The terms of service are great until the powers that be suddenly decide to change them without warning. So, hope you like this video. The next video is going to be on the Enlightenment, that thing I touched on earlier. Immanuel Kant's going to figure prominently. God help us all. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video.